The flickering candlelight cast dancing shadows across the worn parchment as Alessandro di Montecro studied the faces around the marble table. Each man present represented a different faction of the Venetian Republic, their eyes gleaming with ambition barely concealed beneath masks of diplomatic courtesy. The year was 1503, and the political landscape of Italy shifted like quicksand beneath the feet of those who dared to walk upon it. Alessandro had not been born to power. The illegitimate son of a minor nobleman, he had clawed his way from the gutters of Florence to this ornate chamber through the careful application of principles that most men would consider unconscionable. Yet here he sat, while princes and cardinals sought his counsel, for he possessed something they lacked: the intelligence that operates in darkness, the wisdom that thrives in shadow. "Gentlemen," Alessandro spoke, his voice carrying the quiet authority of one who had learned to command without raising his tone, "we gather tonight not to discuss what is right, but what is necessary." The French advance southward while the Spanish fortify their positions in Naples. The Pope plays all sides against the middle, and the Borgia family schemes from their palaces. In such times, survival belongs not to the moral, but to the prepared. The first secret of dark intelligence had revealed itself to Alessandro years earlier, during his youth in the slums of Florence. He had watched a pickpocket named Marco operate the crowded market squares with impossible efficiency. Marco was neither the fastest nor the strongest among the street thieves, yet he prospered while others were caught and hanged. The secret lay not in Marco's physical abilities, but in his understanding of human nature itself. The first secret, the architecture of perception. Marco had discovered what philosophers would later call the fundamental asymmetry of human interaction: people see what they expect to see, and they expect to see what makes them comfortable. The successful pickpocket dressed not as a beggar but as a minor clerk, his clothes clean but unremarkable, his manner deferential but not subservient. He moved through crowds like water through stone, his very ordinariness rendering him invisible to those who might have stopped him. Alessandro learned to apply this principle on a grander scale. In the courts of Florence, he cultivated an image of scholarly contemplation, allowing others to perceive him as a harmless intellectual whose interests lay in dusty books rather than living power. While his rivals postured and proclaimed their ambitions, Alessandro simply listened, observed, and filed away every weakness, every desire, every fear he encountered. The architecture of perception operates on multiple levels simultaneously. At its most basic, it involves the careful construction of one's public persona, not as a disguise, but as a strategic presentation of selected truths. Alessandro never lied about his scholarly interests. He genuinely possessed deep knowledge of classical texts and contemporary philosophy. However, he allowed this single facet of his character to dominate others' perceptions, effectively hiding his political acumen behind a screen of academic respectability. More sophisticated practitioners of dark intelligence understand that perception management extends beyond mere personal presentation to the shaping of entire narratives. Alessandro learned to plant ideas in the minds of others so subtly that they believed these thoughts originated within themselves. During negotiations, he would begin by agreeing with his opponent's stated position, then gradually introduce small qualifications and refinements until the final agreement bore little resemblance to the original proposal, yet felt like a natural evolution of the discussion. The mastery of perception requires an almost scientific understanding of human psychology. People process information through filters constructed from their experiences, beliefs, and desires. These filters can be mapped and predicted with remarkable accuracy. A nobleman concerned about his legacy will respond differently to the same proposal than one worried about immediate financial pressures. A merchant focused on profit margins will see opportunities where a scholar might perceive only abstract principles. Alessandro developed what he privately called emotional cartography, the practice of mapping the psychological landscape of every person with whom he interacted. He noted their verbal patterns, their physical responses to different types of stress, the topics that made them uncomfortable, and the dreams that made their voices soften with longing. This information became the foundation for more sophisticated manipulations. The truly advanced practitioner of dark intelligence learns to operate across multiple timeframes simultaneously. Short-term perception management might involve appearing to concede a point during a negotiation while actually steering the conversation toward a predetermined conclusion. Medium-term perception shaping could involve cultivating a reputation for certain characteristics that will prove useful in future interactions. Long-term narrative construction might span years or even decades, as one's public persona evolves in carefully planned stages to maximize strategic opportunities. The second secret, the cultivation of strategic weakness. The second secret revealed itself during Alessandro's first significant political appointment, when he was named to oversee grain distribution during a harvest failure. Traditional thinking suggested that a man in his position should demonstrate strength, efficiency, and unwavering authority. Alessandro chose a different path, one that seemed counterintuitive but proved devastatingly effective. He began by publicly acknowledging the limitations of his position. In meetings with merchants and farmers, he openly discussed the constraints placed upon him by higher authorities, the inadequacy of his resources, and the impossible nature of satisfying all demands. This apparent honesty disarmed potential opponents who had prepared to battle against bureaucratic arrogance. Instead, they found themselves sympathizing with a fellow victim of circumstances beyond anyone's control. Strategic weakness operates by inverting the natural human response to displays of power. When confronted by obvious strength, people instinctively seek ways to test, challenge, or circumvent it. Weakness, however, triggers protective and nurturing impulses. A man who appears vulnerable invites others to offer assistance, guidance, and support, in the process revealing their own strengths, resources, and hidden agendas. Alessandro's apparent helplessness in the face of the grain crisis led merchants to propose creative solutions they might otherwise have kept secret. Farmers shared information about hidden stores they would never have revealed to a confident official. Rival administrators offered collaboration rather than competition, believing they were helping a struggling colleague rather than empowering a future opponent. The cultivation of strategic weakness requires careful calibration. Too much apparent vulnerability creates contempt rather than sympathy. Too little fails to trigger the desired protective responses. The optimal presentation involves displaying competence in areas deemed non-threatening while revealing carefully selected inadequacies in domains where others possess expertise they are eager to demonstrate. During the grain crisis, Alessandro made certain his mathematical skills and knowledge of logistics remained evident while confessing ignorance about agricultural practices and local customs. This positioning encouraged farmers and merchants to educate him, providing valuable intelligence about supply chains, pricing mechanisms, and regional politics. What they perceived as teaching, he experienced as reconnaissance. The deeper psychological principle underlying strategic weakness exploitation involves the fundamental human need for significance. Most people spend their lives feeling undervalued and overlooked. An apparently powerful person who seeks their guidance and expertise offers them a rare opportunity to feel important and necessary. This emotional reward creates powerful bonds of loyalty and cooperation. Alessandro discovered that people would work harder to help him succeed than they ever would to advance their own interests. The grain crisis was resolved not through authoritarian commands but through a network of voluntary cooperation born from his apparent need for assistance. When the crisis ended, Alessandro found himself surrounded by allies who believed they had discovered rather than created his capabilities. The third secret, the alchemy of information. Information, Alessandro learned, possesses properties similar to precious metals. In its raw form, it holds potential value, but its true power emerges only through careful refinement and strategic combination. The third secret of dark intelligence involves transforming scattered observations into actionable knowledge through processes invisible to those who provide the source material. During his tenure managing grain distribution, Alessandro encountered hundreds of people daily. Each interaction provided fragments of information: a merchant's concern about Norman raids affecting coastal trade routes, a farmer's observation about unusual weather patterns, a nobleman's casual mention of his son's military appointment. Individually, these details seemed insignificant. Combined and analyzed, they revealed emerging patterns that few others could perceive. The alchemy of information operates through multiple transformation stages. Raw data must first be collected without alerting sources to its significance. This requires developing what Alessandro called conversational archaeology, the ability to extract valuable intelligence from apparently casual discussions. A skilled practitioner learns to ask questions that seem motivated by personal curiosity rather than strategic interest. People readily share sensitive information when they believe the recipient lacks the context to understand its importance.
Alessandro would often confess ignorance about military matters while discussing trade routes with merchants, encouraging them to provide detailed explanations of how armed conflicts affected commerce.
These conversations yielded precise intelligence about troop movements, supply line vulnerabilities, and strategic priorities.
The second transformation involves pattern recognition across diverse information sources.
Alessandro maintained what he privately called his web of understanding, a mental map connecting seemingly unrelated facts into coherent pictures.
A nobleman's mention of increased taxation, combined with a merchant's report of unusual military purchasing and a farmer's observation of road construction, might indicate preparations for military action months before official announcements.
This pattern recognition requires disciplined mental habits.
Alessandro trained himself to resist the human tendency toward premature conclusion drawing.
Instead, he collected information systematically, testing potential patterns against new evidence rather than cherry-picking facts that supported initial theories. This intellectual discipline distinguished true intelligence work from mere speculation.
The third transformation involves tactical application.
Raw intelligence possesses value only when converted into actionable advantage. Alessandro learned to time his use of gathered information for maximum impact, sometimes holding crucial knowledge for months before revealing it at precisely the optimal moment. During one memorable negotiation regarding grain prices, Alessandro had spent weeks gathering intelligence about a merchant's financial difficulties, family obligations, and upcoming business commitments. When formal discussions began, he waited until the merchant had committed to an untenable position before casually mentioning information that revealed his knowledge of the man's true circumstances. The merchant, realizing his opponent possessed far more complete information than initially apparent, immediately became more cooperative and realistic in his demands. The alchemy of information also involves strategic disinformation, not lying, but carefully controlling which truths become known to whom. Alessandro would often share accurate but incomplete intelligence with different parties, allowing each to draw conclusions that served his purposes while maintaining his reputation for honesty. This technique, which he termed fractional truth distribution, created situations where opposing parties unknowingly provided him with comprehensive intelligence about each other's positions. The fourth secret, the paradox of control through surrender. The fourth secret emerged from Alessandro's observation of a master chess player who consistently defeated stronger opponents not through aggressive attacks but through subtle positioning that encouraged his enemies to defeat themselves. True control, Alessandro realized, often requires the appearance of surrendering control to others while actually shaping their choices through invisible influence. This principle manifested most clearly during Alessandro's appointment to a diplomatic mission to the court of Cesare Borgia. Borgia was renowned for his directness and brutality, characteristics that made conventional diplomatic approaches ineffective. Alessandro adopted a strategy that seemed to involve complete submission to Borgia's will while actually channeling that will toward predetermined outcomes. Rather than arriving with demands or proposals, Alessandro came bearing detailed intelligence about Borgia's enemies and comprehensive plans for achieving Borgia's stated objectives. He positioned himself not as a negotiator but as a resource, offering to facilitate Borgia's existing plans rather than advocating for alternative courses of action. This approach bypassed Borgia's resistance to external influence while providing Alessandro with significant leverage over the decision-making process. The paradox operates by exploiting the human ego's response to different types of pressure. Direct opposition triggers defensive reactions and stubborn resistance. Apparent cooperation and support, however, encourages expansion and elaboration of one's own ideas. By enthusiastically embracing Borgia's general goals while offering specific methods for achieving them, Alessandro gained influence over both strategy and implementation. The technique requires careful attention to timing and presentation. Alessandro would wait for Borgia to express frustration with current circumstances before suggesting solutions. He presented his ideas as natural extensions of Borgia's own thinking rather than external recommendations. Most importantly, he always ensured that Borgia received public credit for successful outcomes while Alessandro remained visible only as a loyal executor of brilliant plans. This approach generated several powerful advantages. Borgia developed genuine trust in Alessandro's loyalty and competence, providing access to sensitive information and future opportunities. Other courtiers, observing Alessandro's apparent lack of personal ambition, ceased to view him as a rival and began sharing intelligence they hoped might reach Borgia's attention. Meanwhile, Alessandro's actual influence over policy decisions increased dramatically as Borgia came to rely on his counsel for detailed planning and implementation. The deeper principle involves understanding the relationship between responsibility and authority. Most people crave the visible symbols of power while avoiding the burdens of actual responsibility. Alessandro learned to reverse this equation, accepting responsibility for execution while allowing others to claim authority for decision-making. This positioning provided him with operational control while insulating him from the political risks associated with failed policies. The control through surrender strategy also creates sustainable power relationships. Traditional authoritarian approaches generate resentment and eventual rebellion. Systems where nominal authority figures feel ownership of successful outcomes while skilled operators handle practical implementation tend toward long-term stability and mutual benefit. Alessandro's relationship with Borgia exemplified this dynamic. Borgia genuinely believed his own strategic brilliance was responsible for a series of successful campaigns, never recognizing that his brilliant insights were actually carefully crafted by Alessandro to channel Borgia's natural aggressive tendencies toward optimal outcomes. Borgia felt empowered and successful, while Alessandro gained practical experience in large-scale political and military operations. The technique extends beyond individual relationships to organizational and even societal applications. Alessandro observed that the most stable power structures often involved visible leaders who commanded popular loyalty while shadow networks of competent operators managed actual governance. The visible leaders provided emotional satisfaction for followers who needed someone to admire or blame, while the shadow operators maintained the practical systems that sustained civilization. This insight would later influence Alessandro's approach to his own advancement. Rather than seeking high-profile positions that would make him a target for rivals and responsibility for failures, he cultivated relationships with multiple authority figures across different domains, positioning himself as the indispensable advisor whose counsel shaped decisions across various spheres of influence. The fourth secret ultimately reveals that the most sophisticated form of power operates through the voluntary cooperation of those being influenced. When people believe they are making their own choices based on their own reasoning, they implement decisions with enthusiasm and creativity that no amount of external coercion could generate. The master of dark intelligence learns to structure situations so that others' free choices align with predetermined objectives. End of Part 1. Word count, approximately 2,700 words. This document explores the first 4 secrets of dark intelligence through the experiences of Alessandro di Montecros in Renaissance Italy. The narrative continues in Part 2, which will reveal the next 3 secrets, followed by Part 3 containing the final 2 secrets and the ultimate principle of human dominance through self-mastery. The morning sun cast long shadows through the arched windows of the Palazzo Ducale as Alessandro reviewed the dispatches that had arrived during the night. 3 years had passed since his successful mission to Borgia's court, and his reputation as a diplomatic problem-solver had spread throughout the Italian peninsula. Yet what others perceived as political skill, Alessandro understood as the practical application of principles that governed human nature itself. The latest crisis involved a brewing conflict between Florence and Pisa, with Venice positioned to benefit from either outcome. The Doge had summoned Alessandro not to choose sides, but to ensure Venetian interests prevailed regardless of which city ultimately triumphed. This challenge would require the application of more advanced secrets, techniques that operated beyond mere influence to achieve something approaching omniscience within the political sphere. The fifth secret, the multiplication of identity. The fifth secret had revealed itself during Alessandro's careful study of the most successful merchants in Venice's international trade networks. These men possessed an almost supernatural ability to anticipate market movements, to be present at exactly the right locations when opportunities emerged, and to maintain profitable relationships with parties who actively hated each other. The secret lay not in prescience but in what Alessandro termed identity multiplication. The master traders had learned to become different people in different contexts, not through deception but through the cultivation of multiple genuine aspects of their personalities. A merchant might be simultaneously a devout Christian in one social circle, a patron of classical learning in another, and a pragmatic businessman in a third, with each identity absolutely authentic while serving specific strategic purposes. Alessandro began developing what he privately called his repertoire of selves. In Florence, he cultivated his identity as a scholarly humanist, someone whose interests lay in classical texts and philosophical speculation. In Venice, he emphasized his practical skills and commercial understanding. At the papal court, he highlighted his theological knowledge and spiritual contemplation. Each persona represented a genuine aspect of his character, developed through actual study and experience, yet strategically emphasized to create maximum advantage within specific contexts. The multiplication of identity operates on several levels simultaneously. At its most basic, it involves the development of genuine expertise across diverse fields, allowing authentic presentation of different professional competencies as circumstances require. Alessandro spent considerable effort actually becoming the scholar, merchant, and theologian he portrayed, ensuring his presentations would withstand scrutiny from genuine experts in each domain. More sophisticated applications involve the cultivation of different emotional and social styles appropriate to various environments. The analytical detachment valued in academic circles would seem cold and suspicious in merchant negotiations, where personal warmth and shared enthusiasm for profit are essential. The passionate advocacy expected in political contexts would appear undignified in scholarly discussions, where measured consideration and careful qualification demonstrate wisdom and reliability. The technique requires careful attention to consistency within each identity while maintaining flexibility between them. Alessandro maintained detailed mental records of his interactions in each context, ensuring he never contradicted previous statements or displayed knowledge that would seem inappropriate to his established persona in that environment. A scholar might reasonably know Latin but would be unlikely to possess detailed intelligence about military supply chains unless he could provide a convincing explanation for acquiring such information. The deeper principle underlying identity multiplication involves the human tendency to categorize people into familiar archetypes. Once someone has been classified as belonging to a particular type, observers tend to notice evidence that confirms this classification while overlooking information that contradicts it. By carefully establishing strong archetypal identities in different contexts, Alessandro could operate with remarkable freedom within each sphere while remaining largely invisible across boundaries between them. This invisibility became particularly valuable during the Florence-Pisa crisis. Alessandro's scholarly identity in Florence provided access to the humanist circle surrounding the Medici family, where political strategies were often discussed in abstract philosophical terms. His merchant connections in Pisa yielded intelligence about economic pressures and resource limitations affecting military planning. His reputation as a practical administrator in Venice allowed him to propose solutions that incorporated intelligence gathered from both opposing sides. The multiplication of identity also creates psychological advantages for the practitioner. By genuinely developing multiple aspects of personality and expertise, one becomes less psychologically dependent on any single source of identity or status. This emotional resilience provides strategic flexibility unavailable to those whose self-worth depends on maintaining specific roles or relationships. Alessandro discovered that his various identities actually enhanced each other in unexpected ways. His scholarly studies provided historical perspective that improved his political analysis. His commercial experience taught him practical lessons about human motivation that enriched his academic understanding. His administrative responsibilities developed organizational skills that proved valuable across all domains of activity. The sixth secret, the engineering of inevitability. The sixth secret emerged from Alessandro's observation of how master architects designed buildings that seemed to grow naturally from their landscapes while actually representing the implementation of sophisticated planning and calculation. The most elegant structures appeared inevitable, as though no other design could possibly have suited their purpose and location. This principle, Alessandro realized, could be applied to social and political situations with equally impressive results. The engineering of inevitability involves creating conditions where desired outcomes emerge through apparently natural processes rather than obvious manipulation. Instead of forcing people toward particular decisions, the skilled practitioner arranges circumstances so that those decisions become the obvious and logical choices available to rational actors operating within the established constraints. During the Florence-Pisa conflict, Alessandro implemented this technique by gradually introducing information into both camps that subtly shaped their strategic thinking. Rather than advocating for specific courses of action, he ensured that key decision-makers received intelligence that would naturally lead them toward choices that served Venetian interests while appearing to advance their own objectives. The process began with careful analysis of existing motivations and constraints within each camp. Florentine leaders were primarily concerned with maintaining their commercial dominance while avoiding expensive military campaigns that might bankrupt the city. Pisan officials needed to demonstrate strength and independence while acknowledging their limited resources for sustained conflict. Both sides genuinely preferred negotiated solutions but required politically acceptable justifications for making concessions. Alessandro began feeding carefully selected intelligence to contacts in both cities. Florentine leaders received reports suggesting that Pisa's military preparations were largely defensive and that the city's merchants were eager for peace that would restore profitable trade relationships. Pisan officials learned about Florence's financial constraints and internal political divisions that made prolonged conflict costly and potentially destabilizing. This information was entirely accurate but strategically incomplete. Alessandro omitted details that might have encouraged either side toward more aggressive approaches while emphasizing facts that supported diplomatic solutions. He also ensured that each side received evidence of the other's genuine desire for honorable peace, reducing mutual suspicions that might have derailed negotiations. The engineering of inevitability also requires the creation of face-saving opportunities for all parties. Alessandro arranged for a series of apparently coincidental encounters between influential merchants from both cities during religious festivals that provided neutral ground for informal discussions. These conversations, carefully facilitated through mutual acquaintances, allowed both sides to explore potential compromises without appearing to seek negotiations from positions of weakness. As these informal discussions progressed, Alessandro introduced proposals through intermediaries that addressed the core interests of both parties while creating roles for Venice as a guarantor and facilitator of any eventual agreement. The proposals were structured to appear as natural extensions of ideas that had emerged from the informal talks rather than external impositions. The technique's effectiveness depends on understanding the psychological comfort people derive from believing their choices are freely made based on rational analysis of available information. When outcomes feel inevitable, responsibility becomes diffused across circumstances rather than concentrated on particular individuals. This psychological dynamic reduces resistance and regret while increasing commitment to implementation. By the time formal negotiations began, the general framework for resolution had become obvious to all participants. The specific terms required refinement, but the basic structure seemed to emerge naturally from the constraints and opportunities that all parties acknowledged. Alessandro's role appeared limited to providing technical expertise and administrative support for implementing solutions that everyone had collectively discovered. The deeper principle involves the relationship between freedom and determinism in human decision-making. People genuinely prefer making their own choices, but they also desire choices that feel correct and justified. The engineering of inevitability provides both psychological experiences simultaneously by structuring situations where free choice leads consistently toward optimal outcomes. This technique proved particularly valuable for Alessandro's long-term strategic positioning. Rather than being seen as someone who imposed solutions or manipulated outcomes, he gained a reputation as someone whose presence somehow facilitated successful resolutions to complex problems. This reputation attracted additional opportunities while minimizing the political risks associated with more obvious forms of influence. The seventh secret, the cultivation of productive enemies. The seventh secret revealed itself through Alessandro's study of the Roman Empire's approach to managing barbarian tribes along its borders. Rather than seeking to eliminate all threats, Roman administrators often found ways to channel hostile energies toward productive purposes, sometimes converting enemies into valuable allies while maintaining the tension necessary to justify continued military preparedness and political unity. Alessandro recognized that the complete elimination of opposition often created more problems than it solved. Enemies served valuable functions within political ecosystems. They provided motivation for continued improvement, justification for resource allocation, and opportunities for demonstrating superior capabilities. The secret lay not in destroying enemies but in cultivating the right enemies while shaping their opposition into forms that ultimately served one's strategic objectives. During the successful resolution of the Florence-Pisa dispute, Alessandro had gained considerable recognition throughout Italy. This success, however, created a new challenge. His growing reputation attracted the attention of established powers who viewed his influence as potentially threatening to their own positions. Rather than seeking to avoid or eliminate this opposition, Alessandro decided to cultivate it strategically. The first step involved identifying which enemies would prove most useful. Alessandro preferred opponents who possessed genuine competence and resources but whose methods and objectives could be predicted and managed. Incompetent enemies provided insufficient challenge to generate growth and credibility, while unpredictable ones created chaos that benefited no one. The ideal enemy possessed enough capability to serve as a worthy opponent while operating according to principles that allowed strategic response. He found such an opponent in Cardinal Giulio Ricci, a brilliant but conventional thinker who viewed Alessandro's unconventional approaches as dangerous innovations that threatened traditional diplomatic methods. Ricci commanded significant resources and influence within the church hierarchy, making him a formidable adversary. However, his thinking followed predictable patterns based on classical Roman precedents and established theological principles. Alessandro began subtly encouraging Ricci's opposition by occasionally advocating for approaches that he knew would trigger the cardinal's protective instincts regarding traditional methods. These provocations were carefully calibrated to generate criticism that would actually enhance Alessandro's reputation among younger clerics and secular leaders who were eager for fresh approaches to persistent problems. The cultivation of productive enemies requires understanding the psychological dynamics that motivate different types of opposition. Ricci genuinely believed he was protecting valuable traditions against reckless innovation. By acknowledging the legitimacy of his concerns while demonstrating superior practical results, Alessandro positioned himself as someone who could combine respect for tradition with effective modernization. This dynamic created several strategic advantages. Ricci's public criticism provided Alessandro with opportunities to explain and defend his methods in forums where he might otherwise have lacked credibility to address important audiences. The cardinal's traditional approach served as a foil that made Alessandro's innovations appear more sophisticated and effective by comparison. The ongoing intellectual debate elevated both participants while establishing Alessandro as a serious thinker worthy of engagement with established authorities. Alessandro also discovered that the presence of a respected opponent legitimized his own position within various hierarchies. Rather than being dismissed as an upstart outsider, he was recognized as someone whose ideas commanded attention from significant figures. This recognition opened doors that might otherwise have remained closed while providing access to information and opportunities available only to those accepted as serious players in political games. The technique requires careful maintenance of the relationship between opposition and cooperation. Alessandro ensured that his conflicts with Ricci remained intellectual and professional rather than personal or vindictive. He consistently demonstrated respect for the cardinal's genuine achievements and contributions while arguing for different approaches to contemporary challenges. This respectful opposition actually strengthened their relationship while maintaining the productive tension that benefited both parties. The deeper principle involves the recognition that human beings develop their greatest capabilities through constructive challenge rather than uncritical support. The presence of intelligent opposition forces continuous improvement and refinement of ideas and methods. By cultivating enemies who provide valuable feedback and motivation, the practitioner of dark intelligence creates conditions for accelerated development while building networks that can evolve into alliances as circumstances change. Alessandro's relationship with Cardinal Ricci exemplified this dynamic. Over time, their intellectual debates led to genuine mutual respect and occasional collaboration on projects where their different approaches could be combined productively. The cardinal's traditional methods proved valuable for maintaining institutional stability while Alessandro's innovations addressed problems that conventional approaches could not solve. The seventh secret ultimately teaches that the most sophisticated practitioners of power understand opposition as a resource to be managed rather than a problem to be eliminated. By choosing enemies carefully and shaping conflicts strategically, one can transform potential threats into opportunities for growth, recognition, and strategic positioning within larger systems of influence and authority. The autumn light filtering through the monastery windows cast a golden glow across the manuscripts that covered Alessandro's desk. He had retreated to this peaceful sanctuary to contemplate the lessons learned through years of applying these techniques across the treacherous landscape of Italian politics. The success of his methods had brought him to the attention of the most powerful figures in Europe, yet he recognized that the greatest challenges lay not in managing others but in mastering himself. The final secrets of dark intelligence, he had begun to realize, concerned not external manipulation but internal transformation. The man who could control others but could not control himself remained vulnerable to his own weaknesses, desires, and fears. True dominance required something far more difficult than political skill or psychological insight. It demanded the complete reconstruction of one's own character according to principles that transcended mere personal advantage. As evening approached, Alessandro prepared his mind for the contemplation of the ultimate secrets, those that would complete his transformation from a skilled manipulator into something approaching the ideal that philosophers since Plato had envisioned but few had achieved, the human being who had become truly invulnerable through the systematic elimination of everything weak, dependent, and destructible within his own nature. End of Part 2. Word count, approximately 2,600 words. This document continues the exploration of dark intelligence through Alessandro's experiences, revealing secrets 5 through 7. Part 3 will complete the series with the final 2 secrets and the ultimate principle of achieving invulnerability through self-mastery. The monastery bells echoed across the valley as Alessandro stood before the simple wooden cross in his cell, contemplating the paradox that had consumed his thoughts for months. He had achieved everything he had once believed would satisfy his ambitions: wealth that exceeded his childhood dreams, influence that reached into every major court in Europe, and a reputation that would ensure his memory survived long after his death. Yet in this moment of triumph, he felt more vulnerable than he had as a starving orphan in the streets of Florence. Success, he had discovered, created its own chains. The more he gained, the more he had to lose. Every relationship involved calculation about potential betrayal. Every achievement became a target for those who envied his position. Every day brought fresh evidence that external power, no matter how skillfully acquired, remained fundamentally dependent on forces beyond his control. The revelation that would transform his understanding of dominance had come during a conversation with Fra Girolamo, the monastery's elderly librarian. The monk had listened to Alessandro's subtle inquiries about inner peace and spiritual strength with eyes that seemed to perceive more than Alessandro had intended to reveal. "My son," the old monk had said, "you speak like a man who has conquered the world but remains at war with himself. True power begins where external influence ends. The emperor who requires an empire to feel secure will never know security, for empires fall. But the man who needs nothing external to sustain his strength becomes truly unconquerable." These words had struck Alessandro with unexpected force, revealing the fundamental flaw in everything he had achieved. All his techniques for influencing others remained powerless against the most persistent enemy he faced, his own nature, with its endless demands for validation, security, and satisfaction that no external accomplishment could permanently fulfill. The eighth secret, the architecture of inner independence. The eighth secret involved the systematic reconstruction of one's relationship with desire itself. Alessandro had observed that most people lived as slaves to their wants, creating endless vulnerabilities that sophisticated opponents could exploit. The hungry man can be controlled through food, the ambitious through opportunities for advancement, the fearful through threats to their security. But what power could be exercised over someone who had eliminated these internal weaknesses? The process began with what Alessandro termed desire archaeology, the careful examination of every want, need, and craving that influenced his decision-making. He spent weeks in rigorous self-observation, noting when his emotions shifted, what triggered feelings of satisfaction or frustration, and which thoughts captured his attention most persistently. This investigation revealed uncomfortable truths. His apparent philosophical detachment masked deep needs for intellectual superiority over others. His strategic patience concealed anxiety about potential failures that might damage his reputation. His careful emotional control depended on circumstances remaining within predictable parameters. In crisis or unexpected situations, older patterns of thinking and feeling could reassert themselves with troubling intensity. The architecture of inner independence required rebuilding these psychological structures according to different principles. Instead of seeking to satisfy desires, Alessandro began experimenting with techniques for transcending them entirely. He practiced voluntarily accepting uncomfortable circumstances, sleeping on hard floors, eating simple foods, spending days in complete silence, not as punishment but as training for mental independence from external conditions. This practice revealed the distinction between genuine needs and manufactured dependencies. The human body required food, water, and shelter, but it did not require specific foods, particular comforts, or familiar environments. The mind needed intellectual stimulation and meaningful activity, but it did not need constant validation, entertainment, or emotional excitement. By systematically separating actual requirements from habitual preferences, Alessandro began constructing a form of consciousness that could function effectively under any circumstances. The process involved developing what he called emotional mathematics, the ability to analyze feelings with the same precision he applied to political calculations. When anger arose, he examined its components: injured pride, thwarted expectations, fear of consequences. When desire emerged, he traced its origins: memories of past pleasure, fantasies of future satisfaction, comparisons with others' apparent advantages. This analytical approach gradually dissolved the automatic authority that emotions had exercised over his thinking. Instead of being controlled by feelings, Alessandro learned to observe them as information about his psychological state while making decisions based on rational assessment of actual circumstances. Anger might signal that important interests were being threatened, but it need not dictate how those threats should be addressed. Desire might indicate opportunities for satisfaction, but it need not compel particular courses of action. The architecture of inner independence also required rebuilding his relationship with time itself. Alessandro had noticed that most psychological suffering involved either regret about the past or anxiety about the future, while the present moment typically contained only manageable realities. He began training himself to maintain continuous awareness of immediate circumstances while treating memories and anticipations as useful tools for planning rather than sources of emotional disturbance. This temporal reorientation proved remarkably liberating. Past failures could be analyzed for useful lessons without generating shame or resentment. Future possibilities could be evaluated and prepared for without creating anxiety or premature excitement. Present challenges could be addressed with full attention and appropriate effort without the psychological noise that typically accompanied difficult situations. The technique extended to his relationship with identity itself. Alessandro recognized that his various personas, while strategically useful, had become psychological prisons that limited his freedom to respond authentically to changing circumstances. He began practicing what he called identity fluidity, the ability to assume and discard roles without internal resistance or attachment. This practice involved periods of deliberately acting contrary to established patterns while observing his psychological reactions. The scholarly Alessandro would spend days in purely physical labor. The diplomatic Alessandro would engage in blunt, uncompromising conversations. The strategic Alessandro would act spontaneously without calculating consequences. These experiments revealed how much of his personality consisted of habits rather than essential characteristics. The ninth secret, the alchemy of suffering into strength. The ninth and final secret emerged from Alessandro's contemplation of the strange fact that his greatest strategic insights had originated from his most painful experiences. Betrayal had taught him about human nature. Failure had motivated innovation. Loss had revealed the difference between essential and superficial values. This pattern suggested that suffering, properly understood and utilized, could become the raw material for unprecedented personal development. The alchemy of suffering into strength began with a fundamental reorientation toward pain itself. Most people spent enormous energy trying to avoid discomfort, disappointment, and difficulty. This avoidance, Alessandro realized, was itself a form of suffering that prevented the growth that could only occur through direct engagement with challenges. By learning to welcome rather than resist painful experiences, he could transform them from obstacles into opportunities. The process required distinguishing between different types of suffering. Some pain resulted from genuine external threats that demanded practical response. Illness required medical treatment, poverty required economic solutions, conflict required strategic action. Other suffering originated from internal resistance to unchangeable realities: aging, uncertainty, the behavior of other people, the inevitability of loss and death. Alessandro began experimenting with what he called voluntary difficulty, deliberately choosing challenging circumstances that would normally be avoided. He spent nights outdoors during winter storms, not from necessity but to observe his mind's response to discomfort. He engaged in debates where he argued positions he personally opposed, practicing the discipline of understanding and articulating perspectives that conflicted with his preferences. These experiments revealed that most suffering consisted of psychological resistance rather than actual pain. Cold was simply a physical sensation that became torment only when the mind rejected the experience and demanded different circumstances. Intellectual challenges were simply mental work that became frustrating only when the ego insisted on immediate understanding and effortless success. The alchemy process involved learning to extract valuable elements from every form of suffering while discarding the components that served no constructive purpose. Physical pain could provide information about bodily conditions while teaching lessons about mental discipline. Emotional disappointment could reveal unrealistic expectations while developing resilience and adaptability. Social rejection could eliminate dependencies on others' approval while clarifying authentic values and priorities. Alessandro discovered that the systematic application of this principle created a form of psychological invulnerability. When suffering became a teacher rather than an enemy, life could no longer threaten him with anything he feared to experience. Failure became interesting data about the limits of current methods. Betrayal revealed useful information about human character. Loss provided opportunities to practice non-attachment and develop inner resources. The technique required careful attention to the difference between accepting suffering and passively tolerating abuse. Alessandro was not advocating for victimhood or submission to injustice, but rather for a mental stance that could extract value from any experience while maintaining strategic effectiveness in addressing practical challenges. The inner work of transforming suffering into strength actually enhanced rather than diminished his capacity for external action. This approach proved particularly valuable during the crisis that would test all his accumulated wisdom. Word reached the monastery that Cardinal Ricci had died suddenly, leaving behind papers that detailed Alessandro's various activities and methods with uncomfortable accuracy. The cardinal's successor, a younger man with different priorities, had decided to use this information to destroy Alessandro's reputation and eliminate his influence within church politics. Traditional thinking would have demanded immediate defensive action, discrediting the accusations, eliminating the evidence, or neutralizing the threat through political maneuvering. Alessandro chose a different approach, one that would have seemed incomprehensible to his younger self but now felt like the natural application of principles he had spent years developing. The ultimate principle, the indestructible self, the ultimate principle that united all 9 secrets, involved the recognition that true dominance required transcending the need for dominance itself. The man who destroyed his weak self, the parts of his nature that craved external validation, feared loss, and depended on circumstances for happiness, could never be destroyed by others because he had eliminated the vulnerabilities through which destruction becomes possible. Alessandro returned to Rome not to fight the accusations against him but to demonstrate something unprecedented in the political world he had inhabited for decades. He appeared before the tribunal convened to investigate his activities without legal counsel, political allies, or defensive strategies. Instead, he simply told the truth about his methods while explaining the principles that had guided his development and application of those techniques. The confession that should have destroyed him had the opposite effect. By acknowledging his sophisticated manipulations while demonstrating that he had transcended the motivations that originally drove them, Alessandro revealed a level of personal evolution that commanded respect even from his accusers. He showed no fear of consequences, no anger at betrayal, no desperation to preserve his position. The young cardinal who had intended to destroy him found himself in an unexpected position. How does one punish someone who welcomes punishment as another opportunity for growth? How does one threaten someone who has systematically eliminated his psychological dependencies on external circumstances? How does one defeat an opponent who treats victory and defeat as equally interesting experiences? The investigation concluded with Alessandro accepting voluntary exile from active political involvement while retaining his freedom and reputation. He had lost his formal positions but gained something far more valuable: complete independence from the need for any particular external circumstances to maintain his sense of security and satisfaction. The ultimate principle revealed that the highest form of intelligence involved recognizing the limits of intelligence itself. All external manipulation remained subject to forces beyond the manipulator's control. All strategic planning remained vulnerable to unexpected developments. All political power remained dependent on social structures that could change without warning. The man who had destroyed his weak self had eliminated these vulnerabilities by eliminating his dependence on external outcomes. He could continue to engage strategically with the world while remaining internally free from attachment to any particular results. This freedom paradoxically made him more effective rather than less, because his actions could be based purely on objective assessment of situations rather than contaminated by personal fears and desires. Alessandro spent his remaining years in a small villa overlooking the Mediterranean, continuing to receive visitors who sought his counsel on various matters. His advice had gained new authority because everyone could see that he spoke from a position of genuine independence rather than self-interest. He had become what ancient philosophers had envisioned but few had achieved, a human being who remained internally free regardless of external circumstances. The visitors who came seeking techniques for manipulating others left with something more valuable, understanding of how to achieve mastery over themselves. Some grasped the deeper implications and began their own journeys toward inner independence. Others returned to their political games with enhanced skills but unchanged character, destined to repeat the cycle of external achievement and internal bondage that Alessandro had finally transcended. In his final years, Alessandro often reflected on the journey that had led from the streets of Florence to this remarkable conclusion. Every technique he had developed for controlling others had ultimately served as preparation for the far more difficult task of controlling himself. Every secret of dark intelligence had pointed toward the same ultimate truth: real power belonged only to those who had eliminated the internal weaknesses that made external power necessary. The man who destroyed his weak self could never be destroyed by others because he had accomplished the only conquest that mattered: victory over his own nature. In achieving this triumph, he had discovered that true dominance involved the transcendence of dominance itself, leading to a form of strength that needed no external validation and feared no external threat. The 9 secrets had revealed their ultimate purpose, not the accumulation of power over others, but the achievement of independence from the need for such power. In losing his attachment to external influence, Alessandro had gained the only form of invulnerability that reality could not revoke: freedom from the internal vulnerabilities that made all external achievements ultimately meaningless. As the sun set over the Mediterranean on his final evening, Alessandro de Montecros closed his eyes with the satisfaction of someone who had solved the greatest puzzle of human existence: how to live in the world without being enslaved by it, how to act effectively without being attached to outcomes, and how to achieve true strength by eliminating everything weak within himself that had once seemed essential to his survival. The dark intelligence that had begun as a means of manipulation had evolved into something luminous: the wisdom that liberated its possessor from all external dependencies while maintaining his capacity to engage meaningfully with the complexities of human existence. In destroying his weak self, Alessandro had discovered his indestructible self, the part of human nature that remains free regardless of circumstances and powerful regardless of external conditions. End of Part 3. Final word count: approximately 2,700 words. Total series word count: approximately 8,000 words. This completes the exploration of the 9 secrets of dark intelligence and the ultimate principle of achieving invulnerability through self-mastery. The document traces Alessandro's complete transformation from strategic manipulator to inner master, revealing how the techniques for controlling others ultimately served the greater purpose of achieving freedom from all external dependencies.